Your wife's no real soldier. Just another weekend warrior playing dress-up. The words exploded through the Friday night atmosphere of Murphy's Tavern like a grenade detonating in a peaceful valley. Every conversation in the crowded downtown establishment stopped mid-sentence as patrons turned toward the source of the verbal assault. What they witnessed next would become the most talked-about incident in Millbrook's recent history. A night when assumptions about strength, service, and family loyalty would be shattered like glass against concrete. The target of this vicious mockery was Staff Sergeant David "Tank" Morrison, a 34-year-old Army veteran whose massive 6 feet 3 inches frame was currently hunched over a corner table, his weathered hands wrapped around a half-empty beer bottle. Tank's broad shoulders, which had once carried a full combat load through the mountains of Afghanistan, now seemed to bear the invisible weight of civilian life struggles that no amount of military training could have prepared him for. His sandy brown hair was longer than regulation, his beard untrimmed, and his flannel shirt hung loose over jeans that had seen better days. To the casual observer, he looked like just another down-on-his-luck veteran trying to drown his sorrows in alcohol. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The source of the antagonistic declaration was Braden Cross, a 28-year-old real estate developer whose artificially whitened smile and perfectly styled black hair made him look like he'd stepped out of a magazine advertisement. Standing an impressive 6 feet 1 inch with the kind of athletic build that came from expensive gym memberships rather than functional fitness, Braden commanded attention wherever he went. His designer button-down shirt, pressed khakis, and Italian leather shoes probably cost more than Tank's monthly disability check. More importantly, Braden possessed the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never having his worldview seriously challenged. "I mean, seriously," Braden continued, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent tavern as he gestured dismissively toward Tank with his craft beer. "These military wives think they're hot stuff because they can do a few push-ups and march around in matching outfits. But when it comes to real combat, real pressure, they fold faster than origami in a hurricane." Tank's grip tightened on his beer bottle, the knuckles of his scarred hands turning white with restrained tension. His steel-gray eyes remained fixed on the wooden table surface, carved with decades of initials and beer ring stains. But those who knew him could see the warning signs. The subtle shift in his breathing, the way his jaw muscles clenched and released in a rhythm that suggested he was counting to 10 in multiple languages. Braden's entourage, 3 equally well-dressed real estate associates, who followed him around like pilot fish trailing a shark, laughed with the kind of forced enthusiasm that came from wanting to stay on the boss's good side. Jeremy Walsh, Braden's assistant, pulled out his smartphone and began recording, sensing that his boss was building toward something that would make excellent social media content. "Take Tank here," Braden said, taking a step closer to the veteran's table while maintaining what he probably thought was a safe distance. "Tough guy overseas, right? Probably saw some action, maybe even earned a medal or two. But now look at him. Can't hold a job. Can't keep an apartment. Probably can't even keep his little soldier wife happy." The mention of his wife caused Tank's head to lift slowly, his gray eyes meeting Braden's with an intensity that should have served as a warning to anyone with basic survival instincts. But Braden Cross had spent his entire adult life in environments where money and social status provided immunity from consequences, where aggression was met with deference and challenging someone meant having your mortgage application mysteriously rejected. "Oh, that hit a nerve, didn't it?" Braden smirked, emboldened by what he interpreted as Tank's silence. "Let me guess, little wifey is off playing soldier somewhere, leaving you here to drink yourself into oblivion. Probably cheating on you with some real man who actually has his life together." The tavern's other patrons, a mix of blue-collar workers, off-duty firefighters, and local college students, watched the unfolding confrontation with growing discomfort. This wasn't the usual good-natured ribbing that characterized Murphy's Friday night atmosphere. This was something darker, more personal, the kind of systematic humiliation that left permanent scars. Tank slowly rose from his chair, his full height and build becoming apparent as he straightened. Even out of shape and struggling with civilian life, he was an imposing figure, the kind of man whose very presence suggested that violence was always an option, even if rarely chosen. His movement was deliberate, controlled, lacking the aggressive posturing that marked amateur fighters. "You don't know what you're talking about," Tank said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of restrained menace that combat veterans learn to modulate. "And you sure as hell don't know anything about my wife." Braden's confidence faltered for exactly one heartbeat before his need to maintain dominance in front of his audience overrode his better judgment. "Oh, I know plenty about military wives," he sneered. "They marry the first guy in uniform they meet, play house while he's deployed, then act like they're heroes for surviving basic training and learning to fold a flag." The insult was designed to cut deep, targeting not just Tank's wife but the entire military family experience. It was the kind of calculated cruelty that revealed someone who had never faced real consequences for their words, never learned the difference between confidence and stupidity. Tank took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists that looked capable of ending the confrontation with a single blow. But before he could respond, before the situation could escalate to the point where police intervention would become necessary, the tavern's front door opened with enough force to rattle the windows. What walked through that door would transform everyone's understanding of power, service, and the dangerous assumptions that civilian life encouraged people to make about those who had sworn to defend them. Braden Cross had built his empire on the simple principle that intimidation was just another form of negotiation. At 28, he controlled the most profitable real estate development firm in Millbrook County, a position he'd achieved not through innovative business practices or exceptional market insight, but through a carefully cultivated reputation for ruthless aggression that made competitors think twice before challenging him. His psychological makeup was a textbook study in compensated insecurity, the product of a childhood spent as the smallest kid in private school classrooms, always fighting to prove he belonged among the sons of old money and established power. The transformation had begun in college, where a growth spurt and dedicated gym routine had given him the physical presence his personality demanded. But more importantly, Braden had learned that in civilian life, unlike the military world that Tank inhabited, perceived power often mattered more than actual capability. A loud voice, expensive clothes, and the willingness to push harder than others expected could open doors that talent and hard work might leave locked. Murphy's Tavern served as Braden's informal headquarters every Friday night, the place where he held court with his team of associates and conducted the kind of business that required alcohol-loosened tongues and handshake agreements that left no paper trails. The tavern's working-class clientele provided him with a perfect audience, people who were impressed by his success but couldn't challenge his methods, who would laugh at his jokes and validate his superiority without forcing him to prove it against equals. Tonight's entourage consisted of his usual trio of enablers, each serving a specific function in the ecosystem of his ego. Jeremy Walsh, his 26-year-old assistant, was tall and thin with nervous energy that made him perfect for handling the detail work that Braden considered beneath him. Jeremy's primary qualification for his position wasn't his MBA from a decent state school, but his absolute willingness to agree with whatever Braden said, no matter how obviously wrong it might be. Flanking Jeremy was Trevor Banks, the company's marketing director, whose job involved creating the kind of promotional materials that made overpriced condominiums seem like lifestyle upgrades rather than financial traps. Trevor was shorter and stockier than the others, with the kind of aggressive personality that made him useful for intimidating small business owners into selling their properties at below-market prices. His loyalty to Braden was purely transactional. As long as the commissions kept flowing, he would support whatever approach his boss demanded. The third member of their group was Kyle Rodriguez, the newest addition to Braden's team. Kyle had been recruited directly from college with promises of rapid advancement and unlimited earning potential. At 24, he still possessed enough idealism to occasionally question some of their more aggressive tactics, but his student loan debt and expensive tastes were gradually molding him into the kind of person the job required him to become. Braden's relationship with these men was based on a carefully maintained hierarchy where questioning his judgment was career suicide and disagreeing with his opinions meant finding yourself looking for new employment. They had all learned to read his moods, to anticipate his needs, and most importantly, to provide the kind of uncritical support that kept his confidence at the elevated levels his business model required. The psychological dynamics that drove Braden's behavior were complex but predictable. His need to dominate others stemmed from deep-seated insecurities about his own worth, fears that without his money and position, He was still the overlooked kid who got picked last for sports teams. These fears manifested as an compulsive need to prove his superiority through public displays of power, particularly against targets who couldn't fight back effectively. Veterans like Tank represented a particular threat to Braden's worldview because their strength came from sources he couldn't understand or replicate: military service, combat experience, and the respect that came from genuine sacrifice were currencies that his money couldn't buy and his aggressive personality couldn't counterfeit. This fundamental incompatibility made veterans natural targets for the kind of systematic humiliation that allowed Braden to reassure himself of his own worth. His methods were sophisticated for civilian psychological warfare. He rarely attacked directly, instead using social pressure, economic leverage, and public embarrassment to break down his targets over time. Tonight's assault on Tank followed a pattern Braden had perfected through years of practice: identify a vulnerability, exploit it publicly, then escalate until the target either submitted or made themselves look worse by overreacting. The choice of Murphy's Tavern as his hunting ground was strategic. The establishment's layout provided perfect conditions for public humiliation, an open floor plan that ensured everyone could see and hear what happened, combined with an audience of working-class patrons who were naturally inclined to respect success and money. The tavern's owner, Patricia Murphy, was a 55-year-old widow who couldn't afford to alienate customers who spent significant money, which meant Braden operated with virtual immunity as long as he didn't cross certain legal lines. Jeremy held his phone steady, recording everything for what he knew would become content for their private group chat and possibly their social media accounts. In Braden's circle, humiliating videos were currency, proof of dominance that enhanced their reputation among clients and competitors. The fact that Tank was a veteran only made the potential footage more valuable. It would demonstrate Braden's willingness to challenge even supposedly tough opponents. Trevor and Kyle positioned themselves to block potential escape routes, a tactic they developed through previous confrontations. Their job wasn't to participate directly in the verbal assault, but to ensure that targets couldn't simply walk away when the pressure became too intense. The psychological effect was subtle but powerful. Surrounded and outnumbered, most people became more compliant, more willing to accept whatever treatment Braden decided to dish out. But as Braden prepared to escalate his attack on Tank and the veteran's absent wife, none of them realized they were about to encounter something far outside their experience. Their tactics had been developed for intimidating small business owners, desperate sellers, and civilian competitors who operated under the same social rules that Braden understood and exploited. They had never faced someone whose strength came from surviving actual combat, whose loyalty was earned through blood and sacrifice rather than purchased with paychecks and promises. And most critically, they had no idea that Tank's wife wasn't just another military spouse playing at being a soldier. She was Captain Zara Phoenix Morrison, leader of the Army's most elite Special Operations Unit, and she was exactly 3 minutes away from walking through Murphy's front door with her entire team. The transformation of Murphy's Tavern from a friendly neighborhood gathering place into a gladiatorial arena happened with the swift brutality that characterizes all social predation. What had begun as Braden's private amusement was rapidly evolving into a public spectacle, drawing the attention of every patron in the establishment like moths drawn to a flame that would ultimately consume them. Tank's decision to stand had shifted the dynamic from verbal harassment to physical confrontation, a transition that Braden welcomed with the eager anticipation of someone who had never truly faced the consequences of escalation. The real estate developer's confidence was rooted in his experience with civilian conflicts, where superior financial position and social connections usually provided immunity from serious retaliation. He had bulldozed his way through countless business disputes, romantic rivalries, and social challenges using nothing more than aggressive persistence and the implicit threat of economic warfare. But Tank Morrison represented something entirely outside Braden's previous experience. The veteran's stillness wasn't submission. It was the controlled calm of someone who had learned to manage violence as a tool rather than an emotion. His breathing remained steady despite the provocations, his posture balanced despite the alcohol he had consumed, and his eyes carried the kind of alert awareness that came from surviving situations where a moment's inattention could mean death. The tavern's other patrons found themselves caught in an increasingly uncomfortable situation. Murphy's had always been a place where working people could decompress after difficult weeks, where firefighters and construction workers and factory employees could share a few beers without worrying about the kind of social hierarchies that dominated their professional lives. The unfolding confrontation threatened to destroy that sanctuary, turning their peaceful Friday night into the kind of ugly spectacle that would haunt the establishment's reputation for months. Patricia Murphy, the tavern's owner and bartender, watched the developing situation with growing alarm from her position behind the bar. At 55, she had seen enough conflicts to recognize the warning signs that preceded serious violence. Tank's military bearing and controlled responses marked him as someone who knew exactly how much damage he could inflict, while Braden's aggressive posturing suggested someone who had never learned the difference between confidence and stupidity. The combination was potentially explosive, and Patricia began calculating how quickly she could reach the phone to call for police intervention. Jeremy continued recording with the kind of voyeuristic enthusiasm that social media had made commonplace, completely unaware that he was documenting what would soon become evidence in a criminal investigation. His phone captured every word of Braden's increasingly vicious attacks, every subtle shift in Tank's body language, and the growing discomfort of the surrounding witnesses. The footage would eventually serve purposes far different from the social media entertainment Jeremy envisioned. Trevor and Kyle maintained their strategic positions, blocking Tank's most obvious exit routes while trying to appear casual and uninvolved. Their experience with intimidation had taught them the value of indirect pressure, of making targets feel surrounded and overwhelmed without technically doing anything that could be construed as threatening behavior. But their civilian understanding of crowd control tactics was about to prove inadequate for the situation they were creating. The verbal assault that Braden launched against Tank's wife revealed the depth of his psychological need to inflict maximum damage through whatever means necessary. His words weren't random insults but carefully chosen attacks designed to exploit what he perceived as Tank's greatest vulnerabilities: military spouses, military service, and the sacrifices that both required represented concepts that Braden fundamentally couldn't understand, making them perfect targets for the kind of destructive mockery that was his specialty. "Let me paint you a picture of your warrior wife," Braden continued, his voice rising to ensure that everyone in the tavern could hear his performance. "She's probably sitting in some air-conditioned office right now, pushing papers and pretending that her weekend training exercises make her equivalent to real soldiers, playing dress-up in camouflage while actual men do the dangerous work that keeps this country safe." The implications of his words went far beyond simple insult. Braden was systematically attacking the legitimacy of women in military service, the value of military families, and the respect that Tank's wife had earned through years of dedicated service. Each word was chosen to maximize psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability if anyone challenged his right to express such opinions. Tank's response was to take another step forward, closing the distance between himself and Braden to roughly arm's length. The movement was deliberate and controlled, lacking the wild aggression that marked amateur fighters but carrying the unmistakable promise of imminent violence. His hands remained at his sides, but his weight shifted subtly onto the balls of his feet in a way that suggested explosive movement was only seconds away. "You need to stop talking," Tank said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled menace that made everyone within hearing distance instinctively step backward. "You don't know her. You don't know what she's done. And you sure as hell don't know what you're risking by running your mouth." The warning should have been sufficient for anyone with basic survival instincts. Tank's tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, the kind of voice that had directed soldiers through life-and-death situations where hesitation meant casualties. But Braden's psychological makeup made backing down impossible, especially in front of an audience that included his employees and potential business contacts. "Oh, I'm supposed to be scared?" Braden laughed, the sound carrying false bravado that fooled no one except himself. "What are you going to do, tough guy? Beat up a civilian because someone told the truth about your pretend soldier wife? That'll look great in court, won't it? Disabled veteran attacks successful businessman because he couldn't handle honest criticism." The legal implications that Braden referenced were real and significant. Tank's military training made him a deadly weapon in civilian courts, where judges often viewed veterans with suspicion when violence was involved. Any physical altercation would likely result in serious criminal charges, regardless of who initiated the conflict or what provocation had occurred. Braden's strategy was to push Tank into making the first aggressive move, then used the legal system to destroy whatever remained of the veteran's life. But what neither Braden nor Tank realized was that their confrontation had attracted attention far beyond Murphy's Tavern. 3 blocks away, Captain Zara Morrison was concluding a classified briefing with her special operations team, discussing extraction procedures for a mission that had been postponed due to political considerations. Her encrypted communication device had been monitoring local police frequencies as part of standard security protocols when it detected unusual radio chatter about a potential altercation involving a veteran matching her husband's description. The identification had triggered automatic alerts throughout the Special Operations Community's informal network, a system developed to ensure that military families received immediate support when civilian authorities might be inadequate or unavailable. Captain Morrison's team was already moving toward Murphy's Tavern with the kind of tactical precision that had made them legendary among their peers. Inside the tavern, the confrontation reached its critical moment as Braden made the decision that would transform a simple harassment incident into a case study in catastrophic miscalculation. Instead of accepting Tank's warning and backing away, he chose to escalate one final time, pushing the situation beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. "Your wife's probably cheating on you right now," Braden sneered, his words designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. Real women want real men, not broken-down has-beens who can't even function in civilian society. The insult crossed every line that separated harassment from personal destruction, attacking not just Tank's marriage but his fundamental worth as a human being. It was the kind of calculated cruelty that revealed someone who had never learned that words could have consequences beyond hurt feelings. Tank's response was swift and decisive. His right hand shot out with military precision, connecting with Braden's jaw with enough force to lift the smaller man off his feet and send him crashing into a nearby table. The sound of the impact echoed through the suddenly silent tavern like a gunshot, followed by the crash of breaking glass and overturning chairs. As Braden struggled to regain his feet, blood streaming from his split lip and his perfectly styled hair disheveled beyond repair, the tavern's front door exploded inward with enough force to rattle the building's windows. What entered through that doorway would redefine everyone's understanding of military power, family loyalty, and the dangerous assumptions that civilian life encouraged people to make about those who had dedicated their lives to protecting others. The aftermath of Tank's decisive blow hung in Murphy's Tavern like smoke from a discharged weapon, creating a moment of suspended reality where everyone present struggled to process what they had just witnessed. Braden Cross, who had built his entire adult identity around controlling situations through verbal aggression and social manipulation, found himself sprawled across the debris of a shattered table with blood trickling from his split lip and his expensive shirt torn at the shoulder. The transformation from predator to victim had happened so quickly that his mind couldn't immediately reconcile his new position with his established sense of superiority. Into this chaotic tableau stepped an unlikely voice of moral clarity in the form of Detective Sarah Chun, a 15-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department who had been enjoying an off-duty beer at the far end of the tavern when the confrontation erupted. At 42, Chun had seen enough domestic disputes, bar fights, and civilian conflicts to recognize the warning signs that preceded serious violence. More importantly, she possessed the kind of ethical compass that refused to allow injustice to flourish simply because intervening might be inconvenient or dangerous. Chen's background made her uniquely qualified to understand both sides of the developing conflict. Her father had served 2 tours in Vietnam before returning home to face the kind of civilian hostility that made Tank's current struggles seem mild by comparison. Her younger brother was currently deployed with the Marines in Eastern Europe, sending home letters that described the isolation and stress that military families faced when trying to maintain relationships across impossible distances. These personal connections gave her insights into military culture that most civilian law enforcement officers lacked. Rising from her corner booth with the kind of controlled movement that marked experienced police officers, Chun approached the confrontation with her hands visible and her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. Her off-duty status meant she couldn't make arrests or issue official warnings, but her presence immediately shifted the dynamic in ways that both Tank and Braden recognized. "Gentlemen, I think we need to take a step back here," Chun said, her voice pitched to carry throughout the tavern without seeming aggressive or confrontational. "Mr. Cross, you're bleeding and probably need medical attention. Mr. Morrison, you've made your point clear. Maybe it's time for everyone to cool down before this goes any further. The use of their names wasn't accidental. Chun had recognized both men from previous encounters in her professional capacity. Braden's real estate company had been investigated twice for harassment of elderly homeowners, though charges had never been filed due to legal technicalities and expensive lawyers. Tank was known to local police as a veteran struggling with adjustment issues, someone who had been involved in several minor incidents but had never crossed the line into serious criminal behavior. Chen's intervention represented more than simple peacekeeping. It embodied the moral courage that Tank had been defending in his wife's absence. Unlike the other tavern patrons who had watched Braden's systematic harassment with uncomfortable silence, Chun chose to risk personal involvement rather than allow the situation to escalate beyond control. Her decision to speak up demonstrated the kind of ethical leadership that military training emphasized but civilian life often discouraged. Tank immediately recognized Chen's authority and stepped back from Braden's prone form, his military training automatically responding to law enforcement presence even in unofficial circumstances. His hands moved away from his sides in the universal gesture of non-aggression, and his breathing began to return to normal as the immediate threat of further violence diminished. The transition from combat readiness to civilian compliance was smooth and practiced, suggesting someone who had learned to navigate between military and civilian behavioral codes. "Detective Chun," Tank said quietly, his voice carrying respect for her position while maintaining the dignity that Braden had tried to strip away. "This man was making threats about my wife. I tried to warn him, but he wouldn't stop." The explanation was concise and factual, delivered without the kind of emotional justification that might have undermined Tank's credibility. His military background had taught him to provide clear, accurate reports even under stress, and that training served him well in this civilian confrontation. Braden, meanwhile, was struggling to regain both his physical and psychological equilibrium. The blow to his jaw had been precisely calculated, hard enough to demonstrate Tank's capability but controlled enough to avoid permanent damage. Nevertheless, the humiliation of being knocked down in front of his employees and potential business contacts represented a devastating blow to the carefully constructed image that his entire business model depended upon. "He assaulted me," Braden protested, his voice slightly slurred from his injured jaw as Jeremy helped him to his feet. "I was just expressing my opinion about military personnel, and this maniac attacked me. I want him arrested." The demand for Tank's arrest revealed Braden's fundamental misunderstanding of the situation he had created. His civilian perspective couldn't process the difference between expressing opinions and making personal attacks designed to provoke violence. In his world, legal protection was absolute. He could say whatever he wanted to whomever he wanted, and any physical response would be punished by law enforcement and the court system. Chun studied both men with the practiced eye of someone who had investigated hundreds of similar conflicts. Tank's controlled demeanor and respectful attitude contrasted sharply with Braden's aggressive demands and entitled expectation of legal protection without personal responsibility. More importantly, she had witnessed enough of the confrontation to understand the provocations that had led to Tank's response. "Mr. Cross, expressing opinions is one thing," Chun said carefully, her tone maintaining professional neutrality while making her position clear. "But what I heard sounded more like systematic harassment designed to provoke exactly this kind of response. If you want to file charges, we'll need to review everything that happened here tonight, including the statements you made about Mr. Morrison's wife." The implications of Chen's words slowly penetrated Braden's shock and rage. A formal investigation would mean police interviews with witnesses, possible media attention, and detailed examination of his behavior that might not reflect well on his business reputation. His verbal attacks had been recorded by Jeremy's phone, creating evidence that could be used against him if the situation escalated to criminal proceedings. Jeremy, Trevor, and Kyle exchanged uncertain glances as they realized their boss's predicament. Their loyalty to Braden was primarily financial, based on job security and commission payments rather than personal affection or shared values. If supporting him in this conflict might damage their own careers or legal standing, their calculations would need to be adjusted accordingly. Patricia Murphy approached the group with a first aid kit and a towel dampened with cold water, her maternal instincts overriding her business concerns. "Here, honey, let me take a look at that cut," she said to Braden, gently examining his injured lip while avoiding taking sides in the larger conflict. Her intervention provided a moment of human compassion that briefly defused the tension while allowing everyone to reassess their positions. The temporary calm that followed Patricia's medical attention created space for reflection that might have led to peaceful resolution if the situation had remained contained within Murphy's Tavern. Tank's anger was cooling as his military discipline reasserted itself. Chen's presence provided official oversight that discouraged further violence. And even Braden seemed to be reconsidering the wisdom of prolonging a conflict he was clearly losing. But outside the tavern, events were unfolding that would transform this local incident into something far more significant. Captain Zara Morrison's tactical team had received confirmation of Tank's location and the nature of the threat he was facing. Their response protocols had been activated not because Tank needed rescue, his military training made him capable of handling civilian confrontations, but because the systematic harassment of military families had triggered security concerns that extended far beyond personal disputes. The team's approach to Murphy's Tavern was being conducted with the kind of precision that had made them legendary among special operations units worldwide. Their insertion would be swift, overwhelming, and designed to demonstrate capabilities that civilian law enforcement could barely comprehend. More importantly, Captain Morrison's personal investment in protecting her husband would add an emotional intensity to their intervention that would make the evening's events unforgettable for everyone involved. As Chun continued her unofficial mediation between Tank and Braden, none of them realized that military vehicles were already positioning themselves around the tavern's perimeter, and that the woman Braden had dismissed as a pretend soldier was less than 60 seconds away from demonstrating exactly what real military power looked like when family loyalty was involved. The arrival of Captain Robert Hawk Stevens, commanding officer of the Millbrook Police Department's Tactical Response Unit, transformed the already tense situation at Murphy's Tavern from a simple bar fight into something approaching an official incident. Stevens had been monitoring police communications from his home when Detective Chen's informal report about a potential escalation involving military personnel triggered protocols that required supervisory oversight of any situation that might involve veterans with combat experience. At 48, Captain Stevens brought 30 years of law enforcement experience to situations that younger officers might mishandle through inexperience or poor judgment. His graying temples and weathered face spoke of countless nights spent managing crises that could explode into violence if not handled with precise calibration of authority and restraint. More importantly, Stevens understood the unique challenges that veterans faced when transitioning from military to civilian legal frameworks, where the rules of engagement were fundamentally different, but the consequences of miscalculation could be equally severe. Stevens' entry into Murphy's Tavern was accompanied by two patrol officers, Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez and Officer Mike Thompson, both of whom had been specifically trained in crisis intervention techniques designed to de-escalate conflicts before they required more aggressive police response. Their presence immediately shifted the atmosphere from informal mediation to official law enforcement investigation, creating new dynamics that would influence everyone's behavior and decision-making process. The tactical assessment that Stevens conducted upon entering the tavern was swift but comprehensive. He noted Tank's military bearing and controlled posture, Braden's disheveled appearance and obvious injuries, Detective Chen's positioning between the two men, and the nervous energy of Braden's associates who were clearly uncertain about their legal exposure. Most importantly, he recognized the signs of a confrontation that had reached its peak and was now cooling toward potential resolution. "Detective Chun," Stevens said formally, acknowledging her off-duty status while requesting her professional assessment. "What's the situation here?" Chen's report was delivered with the kind of precise efficiency that marked experienced police officers. She outlined the verbal harassment that had preceded Tank's physical response, the provocation tactics that Braden had employed, and her assessment that both parties were now willing to consider peaceful resolution if provided with appropriate face-saving opportunities. Mr. Morrison responded to systematic verbal attacks on his wife with minimal force, Chun concluded. Mr. Cross initiated the confrontation through what appears to be deliberate provocation. Both parties seem willing to disengage if we can provide appropriate guidance. Stevens nodded, recognizing Chen's diplomatic language that protected both men while accurately describing the power dynamics that had led to violence. His experience with similar conflicts had taught him that successful resolution usually required acknowledging legitimate grievances on both sides while establishing clear boundaries for future behavior. Braden, however, interpreted the arrival of official police authority as validation of his position and an opportunity to regain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond his management. His business success had been built on the assumption that law enforcement would always protect his interests against those with less social standing and economic influence, making him confident that formal charges against Tank would restore his damaged reputation. "Captain Stevens," Braden said, pressing the blood-stained towel against his split lip while gesturing toward Tank with his free hand. "This man attacked me without provocation. I was simply expressing my personal opinions about military personnel when he became violent and assaulted me. I demand that he be arrested and charged with assault and battery." The formal complaint was delivered with the kind of entitled confidence that Stevens had encountered countless times from civilians who believed that their economic status provided immunity from the consequences of their own behavior. Braden's version of events conveniently omitted the systematic harassment that had preceded Tank's response, focusing instead on the physical violence that could be documented and prosecuted. Jeremy, still clutching his phone with the recorded evidence of the confrontation, stepped forward with the eager anticipation of someone who believed technology would vindicate his employer. "I have video of the entire incident, Captain," he announced. "It clearly shows Mr. Morrison attacking Mr. Cross without any physical provocation." The offer of video evidence was made with confident expectation that the recording would support Braden's narrative, but Jeremy's civilian perspective prevented him from understanding how the footage might actually be interpreted by experienced law enforcement officers. His recording captured not just Tank's physical response but also the verbal assault that had preceded it, providing evidence that could support either prosecution or defense depending on how it was analyzed. Tank remained silent during these exchanges, his military training teaching him to let authority figures gather information before providing his own account. His posture remained respectful but alert, ready to respond to questions while avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as aggressive or uncooperative. The contrast between his controlled demeanor and Braden's agitated demands was not lost on the police officers evaluating the situation. Stevens studied both men while considering the legal complexities that their confrontation presented. Tank's veteran status created both protective considerations and additional scrutiny. Courts were often sympathetic to veterans facing civilian harassment, but they were equally harsh when military training was used against civilians. Braden's injuries were real and documented, but the provocation that had caused them needed to be evaluated within the context of reasonable response to verbal assault. "Mr. Morrison," Stevens said finally, his tone carefully neutral, "I'd like to hear your version of what happened here tonight." Tank's response was delivered with the kind of precise factual reporting that his military service had ingrained as standard procedure. He outlined Braden's systematic verbal attacks on his wife, the escalating nature of the harassment, and his attempts to warn Braden before resorting to physical response. His account was emotionally controlled but factually comprehensive, providing context that Braden's complaint had deliberately omitted. "Sir, this man spent approximately 15 minutes making increasingly personal attacks on my wife's military service and our marriage," Tank concluded. "I warned him multiple times to stop, but he continued escalating until he crossed lines that I couldn't ignore. I used minimal force to end his verbal assault, nothing more." The explanation provided Stevens with the context necessary to evaluate whether Tank's response fell within legal boundaries for justified force in response to verbal provocation. While physical violence in response to words was generally not legally protected, systematic harassment designed to provoke such violence created gray areas that experienced officers learned to navigate carefully. Patricia Murphy approached the group carrying a fresh ice pack and additional towels, her maternal concern for both men overriding any business considerations about police presence in her establishment. "Captain Stevens," she said quietly, "I've been watching this whole thing develop. That young man," she gestured toward Braden, "was deliberately trying to start trouble from the moment he started talking. Tank here was just trying to have a quiet drink when this all began." The tavern owner's testimony carried particular weight because of her neutral position and her reputation for honest dealing with local law enforcement. Patricia had no financial interest in protecting either man. making her observations valuable for understanding the true sequence of events that had led to violence. Officer Thompson was reviewing Jeremy's phone recording with the kind of technical expertise that modern police work required, analyzing both audio and visual elements for evidence that might support or contradict the various accounts being provided. His preliminary assessment confirmed that the recording captured extensive verbal harassment followed by a single, controlled physical response, exactly the pattern that Tank had described in his statement. The video shows sustained verbal provocation followed by minimal defensive force, Thompson reported to Stevens. No evidence of excessive violence or continued assault after the initial contact. This technical analysis was crucial for determining whether Tank's actions fell within legal boundaries for reasonable response to sustained harassment. The recording provided objective evidence that supported his claim of measured force in response to deliberate provocation, potentially protecting him from serious assault charges. But even as Stevens was evaluating the legal merits of potential charges against Tank, events outside Murphy's Tavern were developing that would completely transform the nature of the incident they were investigating. 3 military vehicles had positioned themselves around the tavern's perimeter with the kind of tactical precision that suggested professional special operations capabilities rather than standard military police response. Captain Zara Morrison's team had completed their approach to the tavern and was preparing for entry that would demonstrate capabilities far beyond anything the local police department could deploy. Their intervention was designed not just to protect Tank from legal consequences, but to send a clear message about the resources available to defend military families from civilian harassment. The sound of approaching helicopters began to register on the edge of human hearing, a low-frequency vibration that experienced military personnel recognized as the signature of special operations aircraft conducting tactical insertions. Stevens, who had served briefly in the National Guard during his younger years, felt the familiar chill that accompanied the realization that a routine police matter was about to become something far more complex and politically sensitive. Outside, the night sky was being illuminated by searchlights as Captain Morrison's air support established overwatch positions that would give her team complete situational awareness and tactical superiority. The demonstration of military capability was intended to be overwhelming, undeniable proof that Braden's dismissive comments about pretend soldiers reflected ignorance that bordered on dangerous stupidity. The first tangible evidence that Murphy's Tavern was about to become the center of something unprecedented came in the form of subtle competency demonstrations that should have served as warnings to anyone paying careful attention. What Captain Stevens initially dismissed as routine police work began revealing layers of complexity that suggested involvement from agencies operating far above municipal law enforcement levels. The transformation began when Officer Thompson's routine review of Jeremy's phone recording triggered automatic facial recognition protocols that connected Tank Morrison to classified military databases. The ping that echoed through Thompson's patrol car computer system wasn't the standard background check that accompanied civilian incident reports. It was the kind of high-priority alert that indicated involvement of personnel with security clearances that exceeded local police access levels. Stevens felt the first chill of administrative concern when his radio crackled with a priority message from dispatch requesting immediate contact with the FBI's Regional Liaison Office. The federal interest in what appeared to be a simple bar fight suggested complications that small-town police departments were neither equipped nor authorized to handle independently. His 30 years of experience had taught him to recognize when local incidents attracted attention from agencies whose involvement transformed routine police work into potential career-defining disasters. Tank's behavior during this initial phase of official scrutiny demonstrated the kind of disciplined patience that marked professional military personnel accustomed to complex bureaucratic procedures. While Braden grew increasingly agitated at the delay in processing his assault complaint, Tank remained calm and cooperative, answering questions with precise factual responses that revealed nothing beyond what was directly asked. His military bearing became more pronounced under official scrutiny, suggesting someone comfortable with formal authority structures and investigation procedures. Detective Chun found herself caught between her professional obligations and growing suspicions that the situation involved factors beyond her clearance level. Her attempts to gather additional background information about Tank through standard police databases returned results that were heavily redacted, with references to classified military service that civilian law enforcement couldn't access. The pattern of restricted information suggested someone whose military career had involved operations that remained sensitive years after completion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Braden's frustration with the investigative process revealed his civilian assumption that police authority operated according to the same social hierarchies that governed his business dealings. His repeated demands for immediate arrest and prosecution demonstrated complete ignorance of the federal protocols that were beginning to supersede local law enforcement jurisdiction. Every complaint about delays and procedure only served to document his role as the instigator of a confrontation that was attracting unwanted official attention. The first concrete demonstration of Tank's capabilities came when Stevens requested identification and Tank produced military credentials that required special verification procedures. The documentation he provided wasn't standard veteran identification but active-duty special operations credentials that triggered additional security protocols Stevens had never encountered in civilian police work. The realization that he was investigating an incident involving current Special Forces personnel, rather than a discharged veteran, completely altered the legal and political implications of the case. Jeremy's continued recording of the police investigation captured interactions that revealed Tank's professional competence in ways that his earlier restraint had concealed. His responses to Stevens' questions demonstrated comprehensive understanding of legal procedures, military regulations, and federal jurisdiction issues that exceeded what most civilians could reasonably know. The casual competence with which he navigated complex bureaucratic requirements suggested someone accustomed to operating within classified command structures. Patricia Murphy's growing nervousness reflected her recognition that her establishment had become the focal point of an investigation that extended far beyond local jurisdiction. The increased radio traffic from Stevens' patrol car, the federal database queries, and the subtle but unmistakable signs of heightened security awareness among the police officers present all indicated that Murphy's Tavern was transitioning from neighborhood bar to potential crime scene in a matter of national security significance. The second major demonstration of unexpected competence occurred when Stevens requested Tank's contact information for follow-up interviews. Instead of providing a simple phone number and address, Tank handed over an encrypted communication device and explained that all contact had to be routed through military liaison offices for security clearance verification. The revelation that routine police follow-up required federal coordination protocols provided the first clear indication that Tank's military service involved ongoing classified operations. Trevor and Kyle, watching these developments with growing alarm, began to understand that their boss had initiated a confrontation with someone whose response capabilities extended far beyond civilian legal remedies. Their business model depended on intimidating targets who lacked resources for effective retaliation, but Tank's apparent connections to federal law enforcement and military command structures suggested access to response options that could destroy their careers and potentially their freedom. Officer Rodriguez's attempt to verify Tank's credentials through standard military liaison channels resulted in immediate elevation to Joint Terrorism Task Force protocols that required specialized federal oversight. The automatic security escalation indicated that Tank's service record contained classifications that treated any civilian contact as potential intelligence compromise requiring immediate containment and investigation. Stevens found himself dealing with federal agents who treated a simple bar fight as possible breach of operational security. The third demonstration of Tank's professional capabilities emerged when he calmly provided Stevens with detailed legal analysis of the harassment statutes that Braden's behavior had violated. His knowledge of federal legislation protecting military families, hate crime enhancements for targeting veterans, and civil rights violations in systematic harassment cases revealed someone who understood legal frameworks from both enforcement and protection perspectives. The casual expertise suggested either extensive legal education or experience with similar cases at federal investigative levels. Braden's response to these revelations showed the first cracks in his confident assumption that his wealth and social position provided immunity from serious consequences. The realization that Tank possessed legal knowledge equivalent to expensive attorneys, combined with apparent access to federal law enforcement resources, began to transform his calculations about the wisdom of pursuing assault charges that might trigger counter-investigations into his own behavior. The fourth significant competency demonstration occurred when Tank's encrypted device received a priority message that required him to step outside for a classified communication. Stevens watched through the tavern's windows as Tank conducted what appeared to be a formal military briefing, complete with map references and tactical terminology that suggested active involvement in ongoing operations. The conversation lasted exactly 3 minutes and concluded with Tank returning to report that additional resources were being deployed to ensure situation security. Jeremy's recording captured the moment when Tank's demeanor shifted from cooperative civilian to active-duty military officer taking command of a developing situation. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. His posture became more formal. His speech patterns reflected command authority, and his awareness of the tavern's tactical environment became obviously professional rather than casually alert. Stevens recognized the change as marking the transition from police investigation to military operation. The fifth demonstration came when Tank politely but firmly informed Stevens that federal jurisdiction was taking precedence over local law enforcement authority effective immediately. He provided contact information for military liaison officers who would coordinate with local police while maintaining operational security for classified personnel involved in the incident. The explanation was delivered with respectful acknowledgement of Stevens' authority while making clear that higher-level protocols now governed the investigation. Patricia Murphy noticed the subtle changes in her establishment's atmosphere as Tank's communication triggered responses from resources that civilian police couldn't deploy. The lighting seemed different, somehow more focused. The ambient noise levels had shifted in ways that suggested electronic surveillance equipment had been activated. Most unsettling, several patrons she didn't recognize had entered the tavern and positioned themselves near exits with the kind of alert positioning that marked professional security personnel. Stevens' growing realization that his routine police investigation had intersected with active military operations created the kind of administrative nightmare that ended careers if mishandled. His radio communications were now being monitored by federal agencies whose involvement indicated that Tank Morrison wasn't just a veteran with impressive credentials, but an active participant in classified operations that made civilian legal proceedings secondary to national security considerations. The transformation of Murphy's Tavern from local bar to federal crime scene was becoming undeniable as unmarked vehicles appeared outside and personnel, with obvious federal credentials, began establishing perimeter security. Stevens understood that he was no longer investigating a simple assault but managing civilian interference with military operations that carried implications far beyond municipal law enforcement authority. As these demonstrations of Tank's true capabilities accumulated, the sound of approaching aircraft became impossible to ignore, and the night sky outside Murphy's Tavern began to illuminate with searchlights that announced the arrival of resources that would render all previous calculations obsolete. The escalation from competency hints to overwhelming demonstration of military capability began with what appeared to be routine tactical assessment, but quickly evolved into a comprehensive display of special operations resources that left everyone in Murphy's Tavern struggling to comprehend the scale of what they were witnessing. The transition marked the point where civilian assumptions about military power collided with the reality of elite unit capabilities operating under wartime authorization protocols. Tank's encrypted communication device had triggered automatic response procedures throughout the Special Operations Community's rapid deployment network, activating resources that had been positioned for entirely different missions but were immediately redirected to support one of their own under civilian threat. The speed and coordination of this response demonstrated the kind of institutional loyalty that bound Special Forces personnel together across service branches and operational boundaries. The first wave of advanced testing came in the form of electronic warfare capabilities that most civilian law enforcement agencies couldn't detect, much less counter. Captain Stevens' radio communications began experiencing intermittent interference that suggested sophisticated signal jamming equipment was being deployed in the vicinity of Murphy's Tavern. His attempts to contact headquarters for guidance resulted in static-filled transmissions that made clear communication impossible without switching to backup frequencies that most local police departments didn't possess. Detective Chen's smartphone lost cellular connectivity entirely, displaying the kind of systematic communications disruption that marked professional electronic warfare operations. Her police radio continued functioning on emergency frequencies, but the selective nature of the jamming indicated equipment sophisticated enough to distinguish between different communication systems and neutralize them according to predetermined priorities. The demonstration revealed capabilities that civilian agencies assumed belonged exclusively to foreign military forces. Jeremy's frantic attempts to upload his phone recording to social media platforms failed repeatedly as internet connectivity throughout the tavern's immediate area became unreliable. His device showed full signal strength but couldn't establish data connections, a technical impossibility that suggested active interference from equipment he couldn't identify or understand. The realization that his evidence of Tank's assault was being systematically prevented from reaching online platforms created the first hints of panic about forces beyond his comprehension. The second wave of capability demonstration manifested as surveillance technology that made everyone in Murphy's Tavern acutely aware they were being observed by resources far more sophisticated than local police equipment. Laser targeting dots began appearing intermittently on walls and surfaces throughout the establishment, visible for only seconds at a time but unmistakably indicating sniper overwatch positions that had been established around the perimeter. Braden's growing agitation reflected his dawning understanding that his demands for Tank's arrest were being rendered irrelevant by military protocols that superseded civilian law enforcement authority. His business success had been built on manipulating legal systems that operated according to predictable rules and social hierarchies, but military justice operated under entirely different principles that his money and influence couldn't affect. Trevor and Kyle found themselves subjects of the kind of background investigation that revealed personal information they thought was private and secure. Their criminal histories, financial records, and social media activities were being analyzed in real time by intelligence assets that could access databases civilian investigators couldn't penetrate. The speed and thoroughness of this digital examination suggested resources normally reserved for counterterrorism operations were being deployed to evaluate every person present during Tank's harassment. Patricia Murphy's establishment began experiencing the kind of systematic security takeover that marked professional protective operations. Customers she didn't recognize continued entering and positioning themselves near strategic locations while maintaining the casual appearance of regular patrons. Their coordination and positioning revealed military training that no civilian security company could replicate, suggesting that Murphy's Tavern was being secured by personnel whose presence transformed it from public establishment to controlled tactical environment. The third demonstration of overwhelming capability came through acoustic surveillance that captured conversations occurring throughout the tavern with precision that suggested directional microphone arrays positioned at multiple locations around the building. Officer Thompson discovered that his whispered communications with dispatch were being intercepted and analyzed when his radio received responses to questions he hadn't transmitted, indicating monitoring capabilities that exceeded anything local law enforcement could deploy. Stephen's realization that his investigation was being observed by federal assets with real-time intelligence capabilities created the kind of administrative crisis that required immediate escalation to state and federal authorities. His attempts to contact supervisory personnel for guidance resulted in conference calls with officials whose security clearances dwarfed his own and whose knowledge of the incident exceeded what his investigation had revealed. Tank's behavior during these demonstrations of his support network's capabilities showed the confidence of someone accustomed to operating with unlimited resources and institutional backing. His calm acceptance of the sophisticated surveillance and communications control being deployed on his behalf revealed someone who had experience with similar operations and understood their implications for civilian authorities attempting to interfere with military personnel. The fourth wave of capability demonstration involved intelligence gathering that revealed personal information about everyone present that should have been inaccessible to any investigative agency operating within legal boundaries. Braden discovered that his private financial records, including offshore accounts and questionable business transactions, were being reviewed by analysts whose access to confidential information suggested intelligence community involvement, rather than routine police investigation. Jeremy's social media history was being analyzed for evidence of previous harassment campaigns and systematic targeting of military personnel, revealing patterns of behavior that transformed his recording of Tank's response from evidence of assault to documentation of his own participation in coordinated attacks on veterans. The thoroughness of this digital archaeology demonstrated investigative capabilities that civilian courts couldn't replicate and wouldn't authorize. Martinez's phone began receiving calls from business associates warning her that federal investigators were asking questions about the real estate company's practices, suggesting that Tank's harassment had triggered broader investigations into systematic targeting of military families by civilian business interests. The speed with which these inquiries were being conducted indicated resources that could examine years of business records within hours rather than the weeks or months that civilian investigations required. The fifth demonstration came through tactical coordination that revealed the scope of resources being deployed to protect a single special operations officer from civilian harassment. Aircraft that had been conducting routine training exercises were redirected to provide overwatch for Murphy's Tavern, creating air support capabilities that most small cities couldn't access during genuine emergencies. Ground units from installations hundreds of miles away were being repositioned to provide backup for what civilian authorities had classified as a minor assault case, suggesting that military command structures treated threats to their personnel with seriousness that exceeded civilian understanding of proportional response. The logistics coordination required for such deployment demonstrated institutional resources that operated beyond traditional jurisdictional boundaries. Stevens found himself communicating with federal agents whose knowledge of military personnel protection protocols exceeded his training in civilian law enforcement procedures. Their explanation that Tank's harassment constituted potential compromise of ongoing classified operations elevated the incident from local police matter to national security investigation requiring federal oversight and military coordination. The systematic demonstration of these capabilities served dual purposes: protecting Tank from civilian retaliation while sending unmistakable messages to everyone present about the resources available to defend military personnel from systematic harassment. The display was designed to be overwhelming and undeniable, proof that civilian assumptions about military vulnerability were based on ignorance that could have dangerous consequences. Patricia Murphy watched her establishment transform into what appeared to be a military command post, complete with surveillance equipment, tactical personnel, and communication systems that belonged in war zones rather than neighborhood bars. The realization that her tavern had become the focal point of operations involving national security assets created concerns about business implications that extended far beyond a single evening's disruption. As these demonstrations of overwhelming military capability reached their crescendo, the sound of approaching helicopters became unmistakable, and the night sky outside Murphy's Tavern began to illuminate with searchlights that announced the arrival of Captain Zara Morrison and her special operations team. The woman Braden had dismissed as a pretend soldier was 60 seconds away from demonstrating exactly what real military power looked like when family loyalty intersected with unlimited resources and professional training that civilian imagination couldn't comprehend. The moment that would transform everyone's understanding of military power, family loyalty, and the catastrophic consequences of underestimating elite special operations personnel arrived with the systematic precision that marked Captain Zara Morrison's approach to every mission she had ever commanded. The transition from civilian law enforcement incident to full-scale military operation happened with such overwhelming speed and coordination that witnesses would later struggle to accurately describe the sequence of events that redefined their conception of what was possible. The point of no return came when Braden Cross, despite witnessing the escalating demonstrations of Tank's support network capabilities, made the psychological decision that would transform him from mere antagonist to legitimate military target. His civilian mindset, shaped by decades of using legal threats and economic pressure to control situations, prevented him from recognizing that he was no longer operating within familiar social frameworks where money and influence provided protection from consequences. "I don't care what kind of military connections this has been thinks he has," Braden declared to Captain Stevens, his voice carrying the kind of entitled rage that marked someone whose authority had never been genuinely challenged. "I'm a tax-paying citizen who was assaulted by this unstable veteran, and I demand immediate arrest and prosecution regardless of whatever federal paperwork he's trying to hide behind." The demand represented more than simple legal complaint. It was a direct challenge to military authority that treated Tank's service and sacrifice as irrelevant considerations in civilian justice. Braden's inability to recognize the escalating seriousness of his situation reflected the kind of willful ignorance that civilian privilege often encouraged, the assumption that personal wealth could overcome any institutional resistance. Jeremy, emboldened by his employer's continued aggression despite mounting evidence of military involvement, made his own catastrophic contribution to the developing crisis. "And I have video proof that this psycho attacked an innocent civilian," he announced, waving his phone triumphantly despite its continued inability to upload content due to electronic warfare interference. "No amount of military bureaucracy is going to cover up documented assault and battery." The accusations of psychological instability and criminal behavior directed at an active-duty special operations officer crossed every line that separated civilian criticism from actionable threats to military personnel. Jeremy's civilian perspective prevented him from understanding that his recording, rather than protecting Braden, was documenting systematic harassment of military families that triggered federal hate crime statutes and national security protocols. Detective Chun felt the situation slipping beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution as she watched both men double down on confrontational positions that ignored mounting evidence of military resources being deployed around Murphy's Tavern. Her law enforcement training recognized the warning signs that preceded institutional responses designed to protect personnel and assets rather than seek compromise or accommodation. "Gentlemen," Chun said urgently, her voice carrying the kind of desperate authority that marked someone trying to prevent catastrophe through final appeals to reason. "I strongly suggest you reconsider your positions here. This situation is escalating beyond civilian law enforcement jurisdiction, and continued demands for prosecution might trigger responses you're not prepared to handle." Her warning should have been sufficient for anyone with basic survival instincts, but Braden's psychological makeup made backing down impossible even when faced with overwhelming evidence of institutional power that could destroy his life with administrative efficiency that civilian courts couldn't match or review. Trevor and Kyle, watching their boss commit what increasingly appeared to be career suicide through continued provocation of military personnel, began calculating their own exposure to whatever federal investigation was documenting their participation in systematic harassment campaigns. Their business model had been built on intimidating targets who lacked resources for effective retaliation, but Tank's apparent connections to unlimited federal and military resources suggested consequences that could extend far beyond civil litigation. The final escalation came when Braden decided to attack Tank's wife directly, using the kind of personal assault that military culture treated as justification for unlimited retaliation against civilian targets. His words were chosen with deliberate calculation to inflict maximum psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions to provoke violent response. "Your pretend soldier wife is probably getting what she really wants from real men while you're here drinking yourself into stupidity," Braden sneered, his voice carrying throughout Murphy's Tavern with malicious satisfaction. "Military wives are all the same. They marry uniforms instead of men, then cheat with anyone who can actually provide for them without government handouts. The systematic attack on military marriage, service sacrifice, and family loyalty crossed every boundary that separated civilian criticism from actionable threats against military personnel and their families." Braden's words weren't protected speech but documented hate crimes that triggered federal protection protocols designed to shield military families from exactly this kind of systematic harassment. Tank's response to this final provocation demonstrated the kind of controlled lethality that marked elite special operations training. His movement toward Braden was deliberate and measured, lacking the wild aggression that characterized civilian fights, but carrying the unmistakable promise of professional violence, applied with surgical precision to achieve specific tactical objectives. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," Tank said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled menace that made everyone within hearing distance instinctively step backward. "You don't know who my wife is. You don't know what she's capable of. And you sure as hell don't know what's about to walk through that door." The warning carried prophetic weight that none of the civilian witnesses could fully comprehend. Tank's confidence wasn't based on hope or bluff but on certain knowledge that Captain Zara Morrison's response to threats against her husband would be swift, overwhelming, and designed to demonstrate capabilities that civilian imagination couldn't conceive. Captain Stevens felt the familiar chill that accompanied his recognition that routine police work was about to intersect with military operations conducted under authorization levels that superseded civilian law enforcement entirely. His radio communications were now being monitored by federal agencies whose protocols treated any interference with military personnel as potential national security compromise requiring immediate containment. Patricia Murphy watched her establishment transform from neighborhood gathering place to what appeared to be a military staging area, complete with surveillance equipment, tactical personnel, and coordination systems that belonged in combat zones rather than civilian bars. The implications for her business extended far beyond property damage to potential involvement in federal investigations that could destroy her livelihood through association alone. The electronic warfare capabilities that had been interfering with civilian communications throughout the evening suddenly intensified, creating systematic disruption of all unauthorized electronic devices within Murphy's Tavern. Cell phones, tablets, and even the tavern's sound system experienced coordinated failure that marked the beginning of tactical isolation procedures designed to prevent documentation or communication of military operations. Officer Thompson's patrol car radio received a priority transmission that made Captain Stevens' blood run cold. All civilian law enforcement personnel are ordered to maintain position and observe only. Federal jurisdiction is now in effect. Do not interfere with incoming military assets under any circumstances. Acknowledge immediately. The federal takeover of local law enforcement authority was delivered with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that made resistance impossible and appeal futile. Stevens found himself transformed from lead investigator to passive observer of military operations that operated under classification levels he couldn't access and authorization protocols he couldn't challenge. Outside Murphy's Tavern, the night sky erupted with searchlights that illuminated the surrounding area with daylight intensity, revealing tactical positions that had been established around the perimeter while civilian authorities focused on the confrontation inside. The demonstration of overwhelming surveillance and fire support capabilities made clear that the tavern had been transformed into a controlled tactical environment where civilian assumptions about safety and legal protection no longer applied. The sound of approaching helicopters became unmistakable as Captain Zara Morrison's insertion team prepared for the kind of dramatic entry that would demonstrate special operations capabilities to civilians who had never witnessed military power deployed with personal motivation and unlimited resources. Braden Cross had demanded to see Tank's wife, dismissing her as a pretend soldier playing dress-up with military equipment. In approximately 30 seconds, he would discover that Captain Zara Phoenix Morrison commanded the most elite special operations unit in the United States military, and that her response to threats against her husband would redefine everyone's understanding of what real soldiers could accomplish when family loyalty intersected with professional capability and institutional backing. The woman he had mocked as weekend warrior was about to demonstrate why special operations personnel were considered the most dangerous individuals on the planet, and why threatening their families was considered suicidal by anyone with sufficient intelligence to understand the consequences. The explosive entrance of Captain Zara Phoenix Morrison and her elite special operations team transformed Murphy's Tavern from civilian establishment to military command theater with such overwhelming precision that witnesses would later struggle to comprehend the speed and coordination of what they had witnessed. The woman Braden Cross had dismissed as a pretend soldier materialized through the tavern's entrance with the kind of tactical authority that redefined everyone's understanding of military capability and personal consequences. Captain Morrison's physical presence immediately commanded absolute attention from every person in the establishment. At 5 feet 8 inches with the lean, functional muscle definition that came from years of specialized combat training, she moved with the fluid precision that marked elite operators accustomed to life-or-death decision-making under extreme pressure. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a tactical bun that revealed facial features combining striking beauty with the kind of hard-earned confidence that came from surviving operations most people couldn't imagine. But it was her eyes that truly captured attention, steel-gray orbs that seemed to catalog every person, position, and potential threat in Murphy's Tavern within seconds of entry. Those eyes had seen combat in classified operations across 3 continents, had made split-second decisions that determined mission success or failure, and now focused on the civilian who had threatened her husband with the kind of predatory intensity that made experienced soldiers step backward involuntarily. The tactical gear Captain Morrison wore wasn't standard military issue but specialized equipment that spoke of unlimited budgets and access to technology that civilian law enforcement agencies couldn't obtain through normal procurement channels. Her body armor was lighter and more flexible than conventional military protection, suggesting advanced materials designed for operators who needed maximum mobility without sacrificing defensive capability. Her sidearm was secured in a holster system that allowed for draw speeds measured in fractions of seconds, while the tactical knife visible on her belt carried the kind of utilitarian design that marked a tool used for purposes beyond ceremonial display. Everything about her equipment and bearings suggested someone who had earned her position through demonstrated competence rather than administrative advancement. The team that followed Captain Morrison through Murphy's entrance consisted of 4 additional special operations personnel, whose coordination and positioning revealed training that exceeded anything civilian witnesses had previously encountered. Master Sergeant Jake Reaper Williams, the team's demolitions expert, was a compact man whose casual movement belied his capability to breach any defensive position within minutes using improvised or conventional explosives. Staff Sergeant Maria Ghost Valdez, their intelligence specialist, moved with the kind of silent efficiency that made her presence easy to overlook until her analytical gaze fixed on specific targets with the intensity of someone trained to extract actionable intelligence from minimal observation. Her ability to assess personality types, motivations, and vulnerabilities through brief interaction had made her invaluable for operations requiring psychological manipulation of hostile personnel. Sergeant First Class Tommy Hammer Chen, their heavy weapons specialist, possessed the kind of physical presence that suggested enormous strength carefully controlled rather than displayed. His positioning near Murphy's entrance created an effective barrier that prevented anyone from leaving without explicit permission, while maintaining the appearance of casual observation rather than aggressive containment. The fourth team member, Staff Sergeant Lisa Viper Rodriguez, served as their medic and communications coordinator. But her medical training extended far beyond battlefield trauma care to include interrogation techniques and psychological assessment methods that allowed her to evaluate target psychology and predict behavioral responses under pressure. Captain Morrison's assessment of the tactical situation inside Murphy's Tavern was conducted with the kind of rapid efficiency that marked someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions based on incomplete information. Her gaze moved systematically from Tank, confirming his physical condition and emotional state, to the police personnel present, evaluating their potential interference with military operations, to the civilians whose harassment of her husband had triggered this response. "Stand down, all civilian personnel," Captain Morrison commanded, her voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that made immediate compliance seem like the only rational response. "This establishment is now under federal jurisdiction pursuant to military family protection protocols. Any interference with official operations will result in federal prosecution under anti-terrorism statutes." The legal framework she invoked wasn't familiar to civilian law enforcement, but the confidence with which she cited specific federal authorities suggested access to legislation that ordinary citizens couldn't access or challenge. Captain Stevens felt his administrative authority evaporating as federal protocols superseded local law enforcement jurisdiction through mechanisms he couldn't understand or resist. Detective Chun recognized the systematic takeover of civilian authority that marked federal law enforcement operations, but the military precision and specialized equipment being displayed exceeded anything she had encountered in joint task force operations. The realization that Murphy's Tavern had become the focal point of military operations conducted under classification levels beyond her security clearance created concerns about her own legal exposure for potential interference. Braden Cross found himself facing the woman he had dismissed as a weekend warrior, but the reality of Captain Morrison's presence bore no resemblance to his contemptuous assumptions about military wives. Her tactical gear, command presence, and the elite team that flanked her with obvious professional competence represented capabilities that his civilian imagination couldn't have conceived or his business experience prepared him to counter. "Are you Braden Cross?" Captain Morrison asked, her voice maintaining professional neutrality while her eyes conducted the kind of threat assessment that preceded tactical engagement. "The individual who has been systematically harassing my husband and making threats against military personnel and their families?" The question was delivered as formal identification rather than casual inquiry, suggesting that Captain Morrison possessed detailed intelligence about Braden's background, business practices, and previous behavior that extended far beyond tonight's incident. Her knowledge indicated access to investigative resources that could penetrate privacy protections that civilian courts respected and civilian businesses depended upon. Jeremy felt his confidence in the video evidence he had recorded evaporating as he realized that Captain Morrison's team possessed electronic warfare capabilities that could manipulate digital evidence in ways that civilian courts couldn't detect or counter. His phone, which had been crucial evidence supporting Braden's assault complaint, was now potential liability that could document his own participation in systematic harassment of military families. Tank rose from his position near the bar with obvious relief at his wife's arrival, but his expression also carried concern about the level of resources she had deployed for what began as a civilian confrontation. The presence of her entire special operations team suggested that military command had classified his harassment as something far more serious than routine domestic dispute requiring local police intervention. "Zara," Tank said quietly, using her given name rather than rank in acknowledgement of the personal nature of her response to threats against their marriage. "These people don't understand what they've gotten themselves into. They think civilian law enforcement is going to protect them from consequences." Captain Morrison's smile in response to her husband's assessment was sharp enough to cut diamond, containing the kind of predatory satisfaction that marked someone who had finally cornered prey that had been causing problems for too long. Her professional demeanor maintained perfect military bearing, while her personal investment in protecting Tank added emotional intensity that made everyone present understand they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Mr. Cross," Captain Morrison said, stepping closer to Braden with movements that demonstrated tactical training in close-quarters combat. "You've been conducting systematic harassment of military personnel, making threats against service members and their families, and interfering with active-duty operations through your civilian business practices." The charges she outlined weren't simple assault complaints but federal crimes that carried prison sentences measured in decades rather than months. Braden's civilian understanding of legal protection assumed that his wealth and social position provided immunity from serious consequences. But military justice operated under different rules that his money couldn't influence and his lawyers couldn't manipulate. Patricia Murphy watched her establishment transform into what appeared to be a federal crime scene, complete with specialized personnel, advanced surveillance equipment, and coordination systems that belonged in military command centers rather than neighborhood bars. The implications for her business extended beyond property damage to potential involvement in federal investigations that could destroy her livelihood through association with systematic harassment of military families. Captain Morrison's team established perimeter security with the kind of professional efficiency that made their control of Murphy's Tavern seem effortless and absolute. Their positioning created overlapping fields of observation that ensured no one could leave, communicate with outside parties, or interfere with military operations without immediate detection and containment. The demonstration of overwhelming military capability served multiple purposes, protecting Tank from further civilian harassment while sending unmistakable messages about the resources available to defend military personnel from systematic targeting. The display was designed to be undeniable proof that civilian assumptions about military vulnerability were based on ignorance that could have fatal consequences. As Captain Morrison prepared to deliver the consequences that Braden's harassment had earned, the systematic transformation of Murphy's Tavern from civilian bar to military operation reached its completion, and everyone present understood they were witnessing the moment when Braden Cross discovered exactly what real soldiers were capable of when family loyalty intersected with unlimited resources and professional training. The systematic delivery of consequences that Braden Cross and his associates had earned through their harassment of military personnel began with the kind of methodical precision that characterized Captain Morrison's approach to neutralizing threats against her operational team and family. What followed wasn't revenge or emotional retaliation, but the clinical application of federal law enforcement protocols designed to protect military families from civilian targeting and systematic harassment campaigns. The first phase of consequence delivery involved comprehensive intelligence presentation that demonstrated the scope of surveillance and investigation that Braden's harassment had triggered throughout the federal law enforcement community. Captain Morrison activated a tablet device that displayed information gathered about Cross real estate development through intelligence assets that civilian businesses assumed were beyond government reach or interest. "Mr. Cross, you've been under federal investigation for 18 months, Captain Morrison announced, her voice maintaining professional neutrality while delivering information that transformed Braden's understanding of his legal position. "Your business practices include systematic targeting of military families for financial exploitation, harassment of veterans to force property sales below market value, and coordination with criminal organizations to intimidate service members and their spouses." The revelation that his business operations had attracted federal law enforcement attention for over a year shattered Braden's assumption that his activities remained below official radar or legal threshold for prosecution. The scope of surveillance indicated resources that could penetrate privacy protections he had considered absolute while documenting criminal behavior he had assumed was legally protected business practice. Staff Sergeant Valdez stepped forward with additional documentation that revealed the depth of intelligence gathering that military family protection protocols authorized when systematic harassment was identified. Her analysis included financial records, communication intercepts, and behavioral pattern assessment that painted a comprehensive picture of organized criminal activity disguised as legitimate business operations. "Your real estate company has targeted 847 military families over the past 3 years," Valdez reported with clinical efficiency. Documentation includes recorded conversations, financial transaction analysis, and witness testimony from victims who have been cooperating with federal investigators to build prosecution cases under organized crime statutes. The systematic nature of cross-real estate's targeting of military families elevated Braden's activities from individual criminal behavior to organized conspiracy that triggered federal anti-terrorism legislation and military family protection protocols. The evidence presentation revealed investigation depth that made civilian legal defense strategies ineffective against prosecution resources that operated under national security authorization. Jeremy Walsh discovered that his role as Braden's assistant had made him a primary target for federal prosecution under conspiracy statutes that treated support personnel as equally culpable for organizational criminal activity. Master Sergeant Williams displayed phone records and social media communications that documented Jeremy's participation in harassment campaigns and his coordination of intimidation tactics against veterans and military spouses. Mr. Walsh, your communication records include 2,847 documented instances of harassment directed at military personnel, Williams announced, reading from intelligence analysis that revealed digital surveillance capabilities far beyond civilian privacy protections. Your social media activities include coordination with extremist groups targeting veterans and systematic attempts to undermine military family support networks. The scope of Jeremy's digital surveillance revealed federal monitoring capabilities that had documented years of criminal activity, while building comprehensive prosecution cases that civilian defense attorneys couldn't challenge or plea bargain. His assumption that social media communication and private messaging provided protection from official scrutiny proved catastrophically incorrect when military family protection protocols authorized unlimited surveillance authority. Trevor Banks and Kyle Rodriguez found themselves subjects of similar intelligence presentation that revealed their participation in organized harassment campaigns and their coordination with criminal networks that targeted military families for financial exploitation. The evidence against them included financial transaction records, witness testimony, and surveillance documentation that made denial impossible and defense ineffective. Your real estate company operates as a front for organized criminal activity, Captain Morrison continued, displaying financial analysis that revealed money laundering, tax evasion, and coordination with criminal organizations that federal prosecutors had been tracking for years. Tonight's harassment of my husband was documented as additional evidence in ongoing criminal cases that will result in federal prosecution under anti-terrorism statutes. The legal framework that Captain Morrison invoked wasn't familiar to civilian defense attorneys, but the confidence with which she cited specific federal authorities indicated access to prosecution tools that civilian courts couldn't challenge and civilian lawyers couldn't counter. The realization that military family harassment triggered anti-terrorism legislation created criminal exposure that Braden's wealth and influence couldn't mitigate. Detective Chun watched the federal intelligence presentation with growing understanding that her local police investigation had intersected with national security operations that operated under classification levels beyond civilian law enforcement access. The systematic nature of evidence gathering and the scope of federal resources deployed indicated that Murphy's Tavern incident was considered significant enough to warrant unlimited investigative authority. Captain Stevens found his authority as local law enforcement supervisor completely superseded by federal protocols that treated military family harassment as national security compromise requiring immediate containment and prosecution. His radio communications were now being monitored by agencies whose jurisdiction exceeded his training and whose authorization protocols operated beyond civilian oversight or appeal. The second phase of consequence delivery involved immediate arrest authority that Captain Morrison's team possessed under military family protection legislation that civilian law enforcement agencies couldn't access or challenge. Master Sergeant Williams began reading federal charges that carried prison sentences measured in decades rather than the months that civilian assault charges might have produced. Braden Cross, you are under arrest for conspiracy to intimidate military personnel, systematic harassment of service members and their families, financial exploitation of veterans, and coordination with criminal organizations targeting military families. Williams announced with the formal authority that marked federal law enforcement operations. These charges carry minimum sentences of 15 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. The arrest authority that military family protection protocols provided exceeded civilian law enforcement jurisdiction and operated under federal legislation that civilian courts couldn't modify or appeal. Braden's assumption that his wealth would provide access to legal defense strategies proved incorrect when federal prosecutors possessed evidence gathered through national security surveillance that civilian privacy laws couldn't protect against. Patricia Murphy watched her establishment become the focal point of federal arrest operations that transformed routine police investigation into national security enforcement action. The implications for her business extended beyond property damage to potential civil forfeiture proceedings if federal investigators determined that Murphy's Tavern had been used to facilitate organized criminal activity targeting military families. The systematic arrest of Braden's entire business organization demonstrated federal law enforcement efficiency that civilian criminal defense strategies couldn't counter or delay. Jeremy, Trevor, and Kyle found themselves facing identical federal charges under conspiracy legislation that treated support personnel as equally culpable for organizational criminal activity, regardless of their individual level of participation or knowledge. Tank Morrison watched his wife's team execute arrest procedures with the kind of professional competence that he recognized from their overseas operations, but the deployment of special operations resources for domestic law enforcement created questions about escalation that exceeded normal military family protection protocols. The presence of Captain Morrison's entire team suggested that federal authorities considered the harassment incident part of larger threats to military personnel and their families. The third phase of consequence delivery involved asset seizure authority that federal prosecutors possessed under organized crime legislation that allowed immediate confiscation of property and financial resources used to facilitate criminal activity. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez began documenting real estate holdings, bank accounts, and business assets that would be frozen pending federal prosecution for crimes against military families. All assets of Cross Real Estate Development are hereby seized under federal organized crime statutes, Rodriguez announced, displaying seizure warrants that had been prepared in advance of Captain Morrison's arrival. This includes business properties, personal residences, financial accounts, and vehicle ownership pending prosecution for systematic targeting of military personnel. The asset seizure authority that military family protection protocols authorized operated outside civilian legal protections and couldn't be challenged through normal civil court procedures. Braden's business empire, built through systematic exploitation and intimidation of military families, was being dismantled through federal law enforcement tools that civilian wealth couldn't influence and civilian lawyers couldn't counter. As federal arrest and seizure procedures reached completion, the systematic transformation of Braden Cross from aggressive civilian predator to federal criminal defendant demonstrated the institutional resources available to protect military families from systematic targeting and harassment. The consequences he had earned through months of criminal behavior were being delivered with the kind of comprehensive efficiency that made civilian legal defense strategies irrelevant against federal prosecution authority operating under national security protocols. The transformation of Murphy's Tavern from crime scene back to civilian establishment marked the beginning of systematic changes that would ripple throughout Millbrook County's business community, law enforcement agencies, and veteran support networks for years to come. Captain Morrison's intervention had accomplished far more than protecting her husband from harassment. It had exposed and dismantled an organized criminal network that had been systematically targeting military families while operating under the protection of civilian business legitimacy. 6 months after the arrest of Braden Cross and his associates, the federal prosecution that followed became a landmark case in military family protection legislation, establishing legal precedents that transformed how civilian courts addressed systematic harassment of service members and their families. The comprehensive evidence that Captain Morrison's team had gathered during their 18-month investigation resulted in convictions that carried the maximum sentences allowed under federal organized crime statutes. Braden Cross received 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, his sentence enhanced by terrorism statutes that treated systematic targeting of military families as national security crimes. The federal judge who delivered his sentence specifically noted that Braden's organized campaign against veterans and military spouses represented exactly the kind of domestic threat that military family protection legislation was designed to neutralize. Jeremy Walsh, Trevor Banks, and Kyle Rodriguez each received 15-year sentences under conspiracy statutes, their participation in organized harassment campaigns treated as equally culpable regardless of their individual level of knowledge about the broader criminal enterprise. The federal prosecution demonstrated that support personnel in criminal organizations targeting military families would face identical consequences as primary perpetrators. The asset seizure that accompanied their convictions resulted in complete dismantling of Cross Real Estate Development and forfeiture of all property and financial resources that had been acquired through criminal activity. The seized assets were redistributed to military family support organizations and veteran assistance programs, creating funding for services that helped other families avoid the kind of systematic exploitation that Braden's organization had practiced. Patricia Murphy's Tavern underwent comprehensive renovation funded by federal victim assistance programs that recognized her establishment had been used without her knowledge to facilitate criminal activity targeting military personnel. The renovation transformed Murphy's Tavern into a veteran-friendly establishment that served as an informal community center for military families throughout Millbrook County. Detective Sarah Chun received federal recognition for her intervention during the critical moments when civilian law enforcement authority intersected with military family protection protocols. Her understanding of both civilian and military perspectives made her invaluable for training other law enforcement personnel in proper procedures for incidents involving systematic harassment of military families. Captain Robert Stevens implemented comprehensive training programs throughout Millbrook Police Department that taught officers to recognize systematic targeting of military families and proper procedures for coordinating with federal authorities when civilian harassment triggered national security protocols. The training became a model for law enforcement agencies across the country. Tank Morrison's adjustment to civilian life improved dramatically following the resolution of criminal charges that had threatened to destroy his marriage and his future. The federal prosecution of his harassers provided validation that his military service deserved respect rather than exploitation, while Captain Morrison's intervention demonstrated institutional support that helped him rebuild confidence in civilian communities. The broader military community treated Captain Morrison's successful protection of her husband as confirmation that special operations personnel possessed resources and authority necessary to defend their families from civilian targeting that civilian law enforcement couldn't address effectively. Her intervention became a case study in military family protection protocols that influenced policy development throughout the defense establishment. Officer Mike Thompson and Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez received specialized training in military family protection procedures that qualified them to serve as liaison personnel for future incidents involving systematic harassment of military personnel. Their experience during the Murphy's Tavern incident provided insights that helped develop standard procedures for civilian law enforcement coordination with military family protection protocols. The electronic surveillance capabilities that Captain Morrison's team had deployed during their investigation became the foundation for expanded monitoring of civilian business practices that targeted military families for exploitation. Federal intelligence agencies implemented systematic oversight of real estate, financial services, and other industries where military families were considered vulnerable to systematic harassment and exploitation. Master Sergeant Williams, Staff Sergeant Valdez, Sergeant First Class Chun, and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez received commendations for their professional execution of military family protection protocols under civilian law enforcement oversight. Their coordination during the Murphy's Tavern incident demonstrated special operations capabilities that could be deployed for domestic military family protection without compromising their primary national security missions. The federal legislation that enabled Captain Morrison's intervention was expanded following congressional review of the case to include enhanced penalties for systematic targeting of military families and broader authority for military family protection protocols. The legislative changes provided special operations personnel with additional tools for protecting their families from civilian harassment that civilian law enforcement couldn't address effectively. Jeremy's phone recording, which he had intended as evidence against Tank, became crucial documentation of systematic harassment techniques that federal prosecutors used to train law enforcement personnel in recognizing organized campaigns against military families. The recording demonstrated how civilian business practices could disguise criminal activity that required federal law enforcement intervention to address effectively. The intelligence gathering capabilities that military family protection protocols authorized were refined following the Murphy's Tavern incident to provide better coordination between civilian law enforcement and federal agencies when systematic harassment of military families was identified. The procedural improvements ensured that future incidents would trigger appropriate federal response without requiring special operations intervention. Community support for military families throughout Millbrook County increased dramatically following media coverage of the federal prosecution that revealed the scope of systematic targeting that veterans and military spouses had endured without adequate protection from civilian law enforcement agencies. Local businesses implemented veteran-friendly policies while community organizations developed support networks that provided early warning systems for systematic harassment campaigns. Captain Morrison's marriage to Tank became stronger following their successful navigation of civilian harassment that threatened to destroy their relationship. Their experience demonstrated that military families possessed institutional resources for protection that civilian harassers couldn't overcome through wealth, influence, or legal manipulation, providing hope for other military couples facing similar civilian targeting. The precedent established by the federal prosecution created deterrent effects throughout civilian communities where military families lived and worked, making systematic harassment of service members and their spouses a high-risk criminal activity that could trigger federal prosecution under terrorism statutes rather than simple civil litigation that civilian wealth could influence. Educational programs developed from the Murphy's Tavern incident taught civilian communities about military family protection legislation and the federal consequences for systematic harassment of service members and their spouses. The programs helped civilian businesses understand that targeting military families for exploitation could trigger national security investigations that operated beyond civilian legal protections. 1 year after Captain Morrison's intervention, Murphy's Tavern hosted a community celebration honoring military families and recognizing the federal legislation that protected them from civilian harassment. The event demonstrated how a single evening's confrontation had transformed an entire community's understanding of military service, family loyalty, and the institutional resources available to protect those who had dedicated their lives to defending others. Tank Morrison spoke at the celebration about the importance of civilian communities supporting military families rather than exploiting their service for personal gain. His words carried the authority of someone who had survived systematic harassment and witnessed the institutional response that civilian predators hadn't believed was possible. Captain Zara Morrison's presence at the celebration, wearing dress uniform rather than tactical gear, reminded everyone present that the woman who had saved her husband and dismantled a criminal organization was both an elite warrior and a devoted spouse whose loyalty to family equaled her dedication to national service. The transformation was complete. Murphy's Tavern had evolved from the site of military family harassment to a symbol of community support for those who served, while the federal prosecution that followed had established legal precedents that would protect military families from civilian targeting for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.